All right, I think we'll get started. I want to welcome all of you onto our virtual Lunch and Learn. This will be the third one we've done since the pandemic began. And as you probably know, my name is Fritz Hamer. I'm the curator of history and archivist here. Actually, this is my last day. I retire officially on the 30th of this month. But I've enjoyed putting these things together and welcoming a variety of speakers. And today we have Joyce Wood, who's a retired professor emeritus at Anderson University, who has been working on some family papers related to World War I and the early post-war period. And she is going to give us a fascinating account of an ancestor. So Joyce, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an honor to be invited to participate in this program and to be able to share some of my discoveries as I work my way through the memoir. Teaching many years, I like to use original materials to help students discover all kinds of unique and exciting things about the different periods of history. And this particular memoir, a fairly standard description of the different places this individual traveled as a member of the U.S. Navy in World War I, has some hidden treasures, and we're going to unpack some of those boxes today. So thank you for joining us. The memoir is entitled Log of a Landlubber because the author, J.H. Minnis, had never been on the water before he joined the Navy. He had been orphaned as a young boy, raised by some distant relatives on a turpentine plantation, and then as an adult, moved to Charleston, South Carolina, married, and by the time World War I came along, he was a businessman in Charleston, a father with a family, and in his 30s already. So along came World War I. Now at that time, the U.S. was not fully engaged in the war. They were supporting the Allies, but preparing. They knew it was coming. And so they had launched a massive shipbuilding effort across the country and discovered they needed mid-level officers for those ships. And so in the spring of 1917, a recruiter traveled down the East Coast, speaking to different groups in different cities. In Charleston, he spoke to the Merchants Retail Association, and J.H. Minnis was inspired by that presentation to go down to the Navy Yard the next morning and enlist, which he did. And here is a photograph, not the best photograph, but Minnis with his family in Charleston. He had to quickly scramble to gather his kit for leaving. He had to make arrangements for the business and went down to his ship assigned in his orders, the USS Panther, sitting there in Charleston Bay at 9 o'clock in the morning sharp, went up to the officer with his papers. And the officer looked down at his and said, "Oh, you've been detached." How shocking. He immediately went to find the recruiter, who was equally shocked. And they kind of figure what happened is the captain was not happy about taking on brand new officers with no training, and he found a way to keep them from coming aboard. This apparently was a problem because they did set up a training program at the Naval Academy, and that fall he went to the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and took a 6-month training program to prepare him to be a mid-level officer in the U.S. Navy. He finally achieved the rank of lieutenant. JG is always tucked in there, junior grade, but I won't try to say that. I'll just call him Lieutenant Minnis. So then from Charleston, he was sent out to San Francisco, where they were busily constructing all kinds of new ships, including the one to which he had been assigned, a destroyer by the name of the USS Schley. And this is a photograph of the USS Schley. It was tested in September 1918, and by October 1918, leaving harbor and heading for the East Coast. This is an official Navy photograph of the USS Schley in the harbor at San Pedro, which is just outside of Los Angeles. When the new destroyer entered the port, the USS Oklahoma, which some of you might recognize if any of you have read about the attack at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. But sailors aboard the USS Oklahoma were studying this ship and arguing over how many smokestacks it had. So look carefully and see how many you think it has. In a moment, you'll see a better photograph. From there, the ship followed down the Pacific coast, went through the Panama Canal and the Caribbean, back up the East Coast, and arrived in its destination of the port of New York City on the evening of November 10th, 1918. And overnight, you can see the photograph, a personal photograph here of where it is moored there in New York City off the 96th Street Pier. Notice the camouflage painting on the exterior. In World War I, the sighting for gunners, both on surface ships and in submarines, was visual. And so the purpose of these designs was to confuse the person trying to make the visual calculations. And if you want to look up something really interesting, look up dazzle paint or camouflage paint in World War I and the very intricate designs that were used on these ships. But at any rate, that morning, New York was quite astir because this headline had come through at 3 in the morning. The armistice had been signed. The war was over. It was November 11th, 1918. And the crew of the Schley had been given permission to go ashore for a couple of hours that morning, from 7:30 to 9:30 in the morning. They could shop, they could get haircuts, whatever it is they wanted to do. They just had to be back at 9:30 because the ship was scheduled to leave the harbor at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Well, they were able to join the party, and a rip-roaring party it was on the streets of New York. When you read his letters describing all the excitement, people swapping hats, carrying on in various ways, carrying a coffin along the streets with the Kaiser's name on it. Quite a celebration. And I thought it was very interesting on November 11th, 2018, that I was able to kind of go through the day and say, oh, he was here at this time and he was there at that time. You know, how many of us can track our ancestors' activities 100 years later on that date? But at any rate, they left the harbor at 2 p.m. to meet with a convoy out in the Atlantic. I'm going ahead and inserting this official Navy photograph of the Schley, taken a little later while they were in Italy in 1919. And go back to the number that you guessed for smokestacks. And this one, I think you can tell when it's been painted back the traditional naval gray. So we see now the track across the Atlantic, followed by the convoys. I'm going to get my laser pointer going here. They met with the troop ships here in the center, traveled across the Atlantic, and the question was, why do they need to travel in a convoy? The war is over. Well, they weren't too sure that all the German submarines had heard that piece of news, and so they continued to escort the troop ships. They left the troop ships in the Azores, then they came up to Port Plymouth, a port just south of London in Great Britain. And J.H. Minnis, as was his habit, every time they were in port, they'd get a few hours of leave, get off the ship and go see what he could. And he and several of his fellow officers took the train up to London and toured as much of London as they could in the 24 hours they were allowed. They did find a hotel, but there were no rooms to be had, so they slept in a chair in the lobby that night. They made it back to their ship, And then their ship again went to sea and was sent to the British installation in the port of Gibraltar, here in the southern tip of Spain. And they spent the next couple of months in Gibraltar. This is his photograph of the gateway into the town of Gibraltar. At one point, he and several of the other officers went across into Spain for a few hours to attend a bullfight. However, they had to change to civilian clothes because they would have been arrested if they'd been wearing their uniforms. Spain was neutral in World War I. Here is Lieutenant Minnis on the forecastle of the USS Schley in December of 1918. What was interesting is, bless his heart, by this time in his mid-30s, his hair had already turned white. What there was left of it, he was almost bald by this point. And he tells amusing stories of people asking him questions, thinking he knew things because he looked older than he was. All right, from the port in Gibraltar then, the Schley moved out to the different ports in the area. It became essentially a personnel carrier and a station ship. As a station ship, what was done in the Mediterranean is American destroyers, such as the Schley, would be posted at different places so that wireless transmissions could be sent seamlessly to keep the different ships connected. By the way, they received a typescript list of news headlines every morning through the wireless. But from Gibraltar then, they also carried what he called notables, officers, British and American officers, Red Cross personnel, because the refugee problem was very serious at this point, food aid personnel, because food was very short and the United States was launching a major effort to provide food in the conditions at the end of the war. And peace commissioners who were being sent on missions from the Paris Peace Conference, which was now underway. And so they would cross over to Tangiers, and then they cross over to Algiers. In Algiers, there was a harbor accident in which the propeller of the ship was damaged, and you have comments thereafter about the problems that created and the operation of the ship. But we're going to use those places as kind of launching points then to explore some discoveries that you can make through this memoir. If you will notice, by this time, this region had once been under the control of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire had withdrawn to a large degree to the area that we now think of Turkey today and the Middle East. We'll have a bit more to say about that. All right, as you can see, Gibraltar is just across the straits from a city in Morocco, Tangier. And that was their first expedition to carry people and pick up people. Here's one of his photographs taken in the square in Tangier, Morocco, in December of 1918. And if you look at the crowd on the streets here, isn't it rather interesting? You would think of a modern square that many of the people in the square would be women. As far as I can tell, there's only one figure that possibly could be a woman right here, because in that culture, women were not encouraged to leave home. They didn't go out and shop. And this is a window here into a different culture. Also, Minnis and several of his fellow officers decided to take a tour of the town. The tour guide, Absalom, had found some mules, and so they got a mule ride tour of Tangier. Minnis is here, third from the left, and you can see several of the officers identified. That brings us now to one of the themes that people can pick up and explore out of the starting with the memoir, and that was a very popular cultural meme in Europe in the 19th century, Orientalism. And what we see in Orientalism is a fascination with a very different and exotic culture. The people were stimulated by the discoveries made by Napoleon during his adventure in Egypt in 1798 and 1799, and it touched off curiosity, as well as the translation of the Arabian Nights in the previous century into French. And people thoroughly enjoyed those stories. So there was a lot of curiosity about the culture of this region. And you can see this show up in some quotations from famous writers. The traveler Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, "Never in my life have I observed anything more bizarre than the first sight of Tangier. It is a tale out of 1,001 Nights, a prodigious mix of races and costumes. This whole world moves about with an activity that seems feverish." Particularly inspired were artists, such as the French artist Eugène Delacroix, one of the first to visit the region, who spent a number of years in North Africa and finding the environment very inspirational in his work. His first sight of Tangier evoked this observation: "I'm like a man in a dream, seeing things he fears will vanish from him." In a recent exhibition monograph that featured many of his paintings included elements from the region. This is his sketch of Tangier when he arrived in 1832. He was actually sent on a mission by the French government. And you can see the Mediterranean in the background there, the walls of the city. Notice that carefully because that's going to show up in the painting in a few minutes. But he would take these watercolor sketches back with him to his studio and use elements in his paintings. This particular painting was done after he returned to Europe, was done in 1858. But you can see that he incorporated Tangier at the top of this mountain, and you see a longboat being landed. He is using that image from his actual arrival in Tangier, which meant landing a boat and then having to wade into the city. However, commentators have pointed out at the time he was actually in Normandy. So this looks a lot more like Normandy right in here. So he liked to combine his elements to create a very powerful painting. His probably most influential painting in the movement was an opportunity to paint the portraits of several women in the city of Algiers. It was very difficult for foreigners, for Europeans, to be admitted into private homes. And in Algiers, this particular family allowed him to come into the women's area, and he painted this portrait of these women. That oil painting later was exhibited in the Salon of 1834, and it was a sensation. People were fascinated with it, and even today, when you look at the rich colors and textures and the lighting, you can see it was just a lovely painting. But it launched art into a whole new realm, into realism and impressionism, movements have become enormously important in the 19th century. That brings us now to another aspect that one can draw from the memoir. We've come from the pretty and the fascinating and the exotic to a problem that caused a great deal of trouble, suffering, and was very, very costly. And I'm sure you're saying by this time, now where are the pirates? You said you were going to talk about pirates. Well, here they are. And they're tied in with the name of a famous ship in the U.S. Navy, the USS Intrepid. Hopefully somewhere in your studies of U.S. history, you have encountered the Barbary pirates. And that is the direction that this exploration now takes us. As we can see, the Ottoman Empire at one time not only controlled the Balkan Peninsula, much of the Middle East, but it also controlled Northern Africa. However, by the time we get to World War I, the Sultan here in Constantinople, also known as Istanbul, had designated governors to actually administer these four territories along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Morocco had its own sultan. However, these governors, also known as Deys, that's D-E-Y, were expected to send tribute home back to the Sultan every year. The tribute was the very finest products, the very best production of that territory for the year. Now, these rulers, however, had to find a way to raise all of that, whether it was money, whether it was various products, or whether it was persons. They had to find a way to collect it. And many of them turned to privateering, otherwise known as piracy, to collect what they would need. These pirates used small ships. First, they used galleys. Galleys are ships powered by oars. Surely you see the ads where the guys, there are 4 guys to an oar chained to their bench, which work very well in the Mediterranean waters because they're so very treacherous. However, by this time, a major technological revolution had transformed Western Europe. Dramatic improvements in the design of ships, in sails, rigging, that greatly increased their speed and distance they could cover. And so you see even the corsairs now are adapting to small sailing ships under this change in technology. But anyone traveling through the Mediterranean was fair game. And so many ships were being captured and their crews held for ransom. The crew, the cargo, and the ship each were held for a separate ransom. But it became quite a scourge and quite a problem in the 17th and 18th centuries. And wealthy, larger nations like Britain and France would pay tribute to these rulers of Algeria, Tunisia, Tripoli, to keep them from capturing ships with their flags. And as long as the United States was flying the flag of Great Britain or the flag of France, they were left alone. But what happened when the United States became independent? Well, now they became targets of the Barbary corsairs. And they started snatching ships out of the Mediterranean. And this became a major challenge to the early administrations of George Washington and John Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson. Finally, by late 1790s, they began trying to sign agreements with these rulers for tribute, $100,000 tribute per year. So they would leave American shipping alone. But we got rather behind in making the payments. One of the problems for the new US government is it didn't have money. The primary source of income was taxes on commerce. And now the corsairs, the pirates, are snatching the various ships engaged in the commerce. And it became a very, very difficult situation. In 1801, the United States had gotten behind in paying its tribute. And so the Bashaw of Tripoli declared war on the United States by going to the US consulate and cutting down the flagpole. They then sent a squadron to try and deal with it. That particular squadron's commander finally ended up just parking the ships in Gibraltar and was very, very ineffective. And then Thomas Jefferson was faced with increasing numbers of captures. And just to give you an idea, it was getting to the order that we were paying out around $10 million for these ransom demands. To give you an idea, a single ship ransom would be $60,000. And to give you an idea of the relative value of money at the time, Thomas Jefferson's home of Monticello, those who've had the privilege of visiting Monticello and seeing his home and property there, in terms of the dollars of around 1800, that property was worth $7,500. We're talking about $60,000 for one ship. You're talking about sizable sums of money. So in 1801, now the United States is 3 years behind. So they send a load of tribute payment to Algiers in a warship called the USS George Washington. It had been a merchant ship which had been refitted under the command of Captain William Bainbridge. And he was sent to Algiers to make this payment. Well, the ruler of Algiers, well, let me get this map, it's a little bit better. Here's Algiers on the coast. The ruler, the Dey of Algiers, found the payment insufficient, not to mention late. And so he demanded, Captain Bainbridge, here's a sketch of the moment. Captain Bainbridge is trying to pay the tribute. The Dey says this is insufficient. And the Dey then says, well, what you can do is you can carry my tribute to Constantinople. And so what he did was load up around his ambassador and around 200 persons aboard this warship, and a whole zoo of animals, including lions, tigers, antelopes, cattle, sheep, and parrots. And so this whole entourage was carried to Constantinople on board the George Washington by Captain Bainbridge. Not to mention humiliating and frustrating. And the American public was pretty upset about this when the news got back to the United States. Of course, that took a couple of months, given the time it took for information to travel across the United States. But meanwhile, this war is going on, and they were still seizing ships. And so Thomas Jefferson sends another squadron to replace the first one. And by the way, the first squadron commander was court-martialed, but sent a second squadron in 1803 under the command of Commodore Edward Preble. And that squadron included a couple of brand new warships. The U.S. Congress finally grit its teeth and committed to building some ocean Navy ships, frigates, which ran 36-40 guns each. And two of the new ones were sent in the squadron. One of them was the USS Constitution. Hopefully some of you have been able to visit that ship. It is now a museum. The other was a USS Philadelphia. So USS Philadelphia was sent on to Tripoli while Commodore Preble signed an agreement with the Sultan of Morocco. He got that achieved. But meanwhile, the Philadelphia, and this is a contemporary image, the Philadelphia got in trouble in Tripoli Bay, grounded itself in the treacherous waters there. And though they tried to defend themselves, they ended up having to surrender, and the ship went into the hands of the Tripolitans, I think they called them, and the crew was imprisoned, a crew of over 300. Now, an embarrassment had become a crisis. What were they going to do about it? The demand of ransom, of course, was significantly more than ever before. And actually, the Pasha of Tripoli sold the ship to the Dey of Tunis. He'd already sold it by the time all of this was going on. The crew, the officers were housed separately from the regular crew, but the regular crew was put to hard labor, put to work in a quarry, carrying stones and dirt to help build some facilities there in Tripoli Harbor. And the experience of the crew is recounted in a book called The Horrors of Slavery by one of the survivors, William Ray, if anyone wants to read more about it. It's quite interesting. But this, Thomas Jefferson realized it was going to have to be dealt with forcefully, or number one, the United States would have no respect, but secondly, it would only get worse. And so the squadron then launched a small sailing vessel, had been renamed the USS Intrepid, under the command of Lieutenant Stephen Decatur. And Decatur then entered Tripoli Bay, set the Philadelphia on fire, This famous painting shows you that moment when the Philadelphia is going up in flames. The cannons had all been set up and primed, ready to fire, so that when the heat of the burning ship hit the cannons, they all went off. And you had this ordnance flying over the city of Tripoli. People were having cannonballs drop down on the houses. And actually, one of the cannonballs went through the place where the captain was imprisoned, came down to the roof, floor, right through the room in which he was sleeping. The day, of course, was furious. But the result ultimately was that the crew was released and allowed to return home, except for a couple of members of the crew who decided they would try and ease their harsh conditions by doing what was commonly called then turning Turk. In other words, converting to Islam for the sake of a little better food and treatment. Well, as the crew was preparing for departure, the day of Tripoli invited those individuals who converted Islam to come in. And he said, well, your fellow crew members are heading back home. Would you like to go? And they all said, yes, yes, yes. And they didn't realize this was a test. And as soon as he saw their response, they got a quick trip to the back corners of the Sahara Desert, and they didn't get to go home. But what happened to ships where the crew was not ransomed? This is an 1816 illustration of a group of those individuals being marched off, chained together to work on a job like in a quarry or something like that. You can tell they are Europeans. This is one of the surprising things I found in this research was the sheer number of European background slaves in North Africa. You can tell to some degree because you see some of them have kept their hats. A hat was a very important fashion item in Europe at the time. It was also very expensive. And you've ever heard the phrase when you're getting ready to plunge into something new and difficult, hold on to your hat. These guys had held on to their hats, which was an enormously valuable thing to do in the intense sun of North Africa. So this is another aspect that can be explored. All right, as we can see the significance between these events and the Intrepid had led to the burning of the Philadelphia and the Tripoli harbor. And this garnered significant respect among many other countries. Lord Horatio Nelson, the British admiral who commanded the British fleet that destroyed Napoleon's navy at Trafalgar in 1805, made this comment. He called it the most bold and daring act of the age, end of quote. So this put the United States on the map as a nation that could defend itself, a nation that would have its place on the seas of the world. Now, the U.S. Navy has kept a ship named Intrepid ever since. When Lieutenant Minnis was waiting on the construction or the completion of construction of his ship in the San Francisco harbor, the sailing ship on which he was provided quarters, on which he was housed, was called USS Intrepid. It was the third ship of that name. The fourth ship of that name is today in New York Harbor. This is an aircraft carrier that saw action during World War II. Actually, it suffered severe damage from kamikaze pilots, was towed back, repaired, and sent back into the war. And it remained in service until the Vietnam War. When it was retired, it was brought to New York City. That's the building area you see behind you. And today it is a naval, air, and space museum because the nation's first space shuttle, the Enterprise, is on exhibit there. And for those of you who are interested, who have young people looking for something to do, the website for the Intrepid in New York has activities for many different age levels. Our third area that we're going to explore is another one of the ports where they visited, the port of Algiers, which later became the capital of the French colony of Algeria. And what we see in the port of Algiers, I'm going to come back to the map just a moment here. Algiers is on the coast. The French built a whole nother section to the city. However, the traditional section is called the Kasbah. If you ever run into that term in movies or cartoons, that's what it's referring to. But as you can see, Algeria came under French control in 1830. You see other areas along the North African coast also coming under European control. And when that occurred, the piracy came to an end. No more piracy, and slavery was abolished. That was another fruit of European colonialism. Now, Algiers became a favorite destination for artists. And we see here one artist who spent a good bit of time there, Pierre-Auguste Renoir. The impact of the beautiful, bright colors and climate of Algeria can be seen in his work. He is significant in developing a movement called Impressionism. And I have two examples of Renoir's work here, one called Algerian Girl, marvelous colors, and here's another one called Boy with an Orange. And the reason why I'm including these, if you've never had a chance to see a Renoir, these two are exhibited at the Biltmore Estate Collection in Asheville, North Carolina. George Washington Vanderbilt bought them in 1892. Now, this particular older photograph of one of the guest bedrooms in Biltmore shows where they were originally hung. Boy with an Orange, you can see here, is hanging over the fireplace in what was called the Chippendale Room. Today, however, Biltmore has moved their most valuable artifacts, such as the Renoir paintings, to a very fine museum on the estate. And that is where you would need to go to see them today. Well, another comment about Algiers in the culture of the day is that people in Northern Europe particularly suffered a lot of illness, particularly lung ailments. They lived in a damp, chilly, kind of like cold climate with a great deal of pollution and had many lung problems. And so doctors would prescribe a visit to Algiers for the sake of a person's health. One such visitor was one Karl Marx. You may have heard of him. He was author of, one of the co-authors of the Communist Manifesto, and at this time was working on the major classic of his life called Das Kapital. However, his beloved wife, by the way, he was living in London at this time. His beloved wife, Jenny, died in 1881, and his health began to decline severely. So his doctor recommended he go to Algiers. And so he spent some time there in 1882, where this last portrait was taken in Algiers. Unfortunately, however, he returned to London and died in 1883. I'm going to finish then with kind of a little whimsical photograph here from the memoir. In January 1919 in Brindisi, Italy, which is rather southern Italy. People don't think of a place buried in snow, but they got a very good snowfall and were able to build a snowman on the ship. But January 2019, the same thing happened in Brindisi. I thought that was an interesting centennial celebration. This memoir and the fascinating discoveries made as a curious reader explores new and unusual avenues hidden inside of his pages provides an example of the opportunities awaiting educators and interested readers to go into the wonders and mysteries of the past with carefully selected primary sources. The surface account of ports visited, dignitaries transported, the challenges of life aboard a ship in the closing months of a war and crafting a peace can be a vehicle that can give students remarkable insights into human responses to varied conditions and cultures. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share my discoveries. If it's possible, are there any questions anyone might have?
Are there any questions? address to Joyce. Fascinating account. Well, I was wondering, does Minnis talk at all about his duties and what it was like adapting to sea life?
Oh, yes, a great deal. I did not go into a lot of that, but there are significant descriptions of his duties. A lot of time spent on watch, a lot of time spent on watch with a bucket right at your feet. He had a terrible time with seasickness.
I was
And you,
wondering, as a land,
yeah, the ship, I looked up its dimensions. It was about 300 feet long and 30 feet wide.
Mhm.
And if you can imagine, it had a crew of around 130 people on board.
Mm.
So that small ship crossing the North Atlantic in November,
Mm.
the North Atlantic in November is not a calm place to be, to put it mildly. They did a lot of rolling. He tells some, they sound funny tales of your food rolling across the table away from you when you were trying to eat, trying to move between things, grabbing ropes and so on. And I remember as a child, he told me his solution to the seasickness and how he handled it, because there wasn't any choice. He just had to keep going.
Right. What was his solution?
Okay, the doctor told him, eat anyway.
Oh, uh-huh.
He said that you'll get enough nutrition. Yes, someone's going to come up, but you'll get enough nutrition that way that you'll be able to keep going.
Wow. Did he ever get over it?
I think after a while that he was able to adjust, and then they would go to port,
Mm-hmm.
or he'd be on land. I noticed that after he came back, there was no more going to sea again for him. He stayed on the land.
Wow. Interesting. Well, if there's no other questions for anyone out there in the cyberspace, I want to thank you, Joyce, for being a part of our Lunch and Learn program, and let everyone know that we're going to take a break in July. There will not be a program, but we have one starting up again in August, the last Friday of the month. So stay tuned for that, and join us on our various online programs. And do note that the museum is now open to the public. The hours are close to normal, except we close at 4 o'clock instead of 5, Monday through Saturday. I'm sorry, Tuesday through Saturday. And we are closed on Sunday and Monday for the time being. So keep that in mind. And if you feel so inclined, feel free to come and join us here to see the exhibits and talk to us. Thank you all very much. You all have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.